Imagine a man so powerful, the people believed the pharaoh personally maintained Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. If he failed in his rituals, the Nile might not flood, crops might fail, enemies might invade. His spiritual duties were not ceremonial. They were survival. This is not a fairy tale. It is one of the most documented civilizations in human history. Thousands of inscriptions, papyrus scrolls, and tomb paintings have survived for 3,000 years, giving us a detailed, intimate picture of how the pharaoh truly lived. So let us begin. The sun rises over the Nile. The palace wakes, and the god-king opens his eyes to another day of ruling the most powerful nation on earth. The pharaoh did not wake the way you and I do. His awakening was a religious ceremony. Priests chanted hymns to the rising sun, because the pharaoh's waking mirrored the sun god Ra's daily journey across the sky. Before the pharaoh could be seen by anyone outside his innermost circle, he underwent the opening of the mouth ritual, a symbolic ceremony where priests opened his senses with sacred instruments so he could receive the god's will for the day. His sleeping chamber was a masterpiece of Egyptian art. Painted walls depicted gods and stars. His bed was carved from ebony and gold, raised on a platform. Beside it, alabaster jars of sacred water and a golden lamp that burned all night. He was never alone. Even as he slept, a rotating team of priests kept watch, chanting protective spells to guard against evil spirits and ensure the divine force within him remained safe through the vulnerable hours of darkness. At dawn, servants entered with oil lamps, filling the room with warm light and the scent of kifi, a sacred perfume made from myrrh, juniper, and wine, burned every morning and evening in Egyptian temples and palaces. The first act of every pharaoh's day was purification. He was bathed in water from a sacred pool, sometimes scented with lotus flowers. The bath was not for hygiene alone. It was a ritual cleansing of his divine body, preparing it for contact with the gods. After the bath, his body was anointed with 7 different sacred oils, one for each body part, each corresponding to a different deity. The priests who applied these oils had spent years in training. An incorrectly anointed pharaoh was a cosmic problem. Then came the clothing. The pharaoh's wardrobe was extraordinary. Fine white linen, the most prized textile in the ancient world, sometimes woven so thin it was nearly translucent. Egyptians called their highest quality linen royal linen, and only the pharaoh wore the finest grade. The kilt, called a shendit, was the essential garment. For ceremony, it was pleated and stiffened with starch into architectural folds. Over it went a bull's tail, symbolizing royal power. Sandals of gilded leather completed the ensemble. Next, the crown. Depending on the occasion, the pharaoh might wear the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, or the double crown combining both. For battle, the blue Kypresh crown. For ritual, the Atef crown, heavy with ostrich feathers. Then the false beard, a braided ornament of real or artificial hair tied to the chin by a cord. Even female pharaohs wore it. It was not vanity. The beard was the mark of divine authority, connecting the living ruler to the image of Osiris. The eyes were lined with kohl, a mineral cosmetic made from lead sulfide or stibnite. It was not just fashion. Kohl protected against eye infections in the bright desert sun and was believed to invoke the protective eye of Horus. By the time the pharaoh emerged from his inner chambers, bathed, anointed, dressed, crowned, and made up, he was no longer a sleepy man. He was a walking, breathing sacred icon, and every person who saw him would prostrate themselves on the floor. Breakfast was brought by a team of servants who had themselves been purified before entering the royal kitchen. The pharaoh ate in a private chamber, served by only his most trusted officials. Even the act of eating was ceremonially significant. His morning meal might include bread, made from fine emmer wheat, alongside roasted duck or fish, honey cakes, figs, dates, and beer. Egyptian beer was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than the beverage we know today. The pharaoh drank from cups of gold or alabaster. As he ate, scribes arrived with the morning reports. Harvests, army movements, tribute arriving from vassal states, temple construction progress, diplomatic messages from foreign powers. The pharaoh's day was already full before he had finished his first meal. The pharaoh's palace was a city within a city. In 1000 BC, major royal residences existed at Tanis and Memphis, vast complexes of mud brick and stone covering hundreds of acres, housing thousands of people. The palace was divided into distinct zones: the public areas where officials and petitioners could approach, the administrative zone for government work, the sacred zone containing the private temple, and the innermost residential quarters, accessible to almost no one. The main audience hall, called the Great House, was immense. Rows of painted columns rose to a lofty ceiling. The floor was tiled in patterns imitating water, with fish and lotus flowers. Walking to the throne felt like walking across the Nile itself. The throne was a symbol of the universe. It sat on a raised dais, steps representing the primordial mound of creation that had risen from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. To ascend the throne was, literally, to reenact the creation of the world. Around the throne room, paintings covered every surface. Not random decoration. Every image was chosen to reinforce the pharaoh's power. Foreign enemies crushed underfoot. Gods placing the crown on the pharaoh's head. The Nile flooding in abundance as a reward for his righteousness. The palace gardens were a wonder in a desert country. Irrigated by channels from the Nile, they contained imported trees, cedars from Lebanon, ebony from Nubia, alongside Egyptian sycamores, persea trees sacred to the goddess Hathor, and date palms. Sacred pools gleamed in the garden, stocked with fish and lotus flowers crossed by stone bridges. The pharaoh could stroll here in the evening, watching herons and ibis birds walk through the shallows. It was the closest thing to paradise that the ancient world could build. The palace had its own zoo. Exotic animals from conquered or traded lands were kept as symbols of the pharaoh's power over all creation: lions, leopards, baboons, giraffes, and ostriches. Some pharaohs kept pet lions that walked beside them in procession. The royal harem, called the cap, was a separate palace complex. The pharaoh had multiple wives. His chief wife, the great royal wife, was his political and spiritual partner. Other wives might number in the dozens. Their sons competed for succession. The great royal wife held immense power. She participated in religious ceremonies, managed her own estates, commanded her own staff, and could influence foreign policy through the diplomatic marriages that brought her rivals and sisters into the royal family. Children of the royal harem were educated in the palace school alongside the sons of high officials and foreign princes sent as political hostages. This system ensured that when a new pharaoh rose, all of Egypt's elite had grown up together, bonded by shared childhood. The palace also housed the royal workshops, staffed by the most skilled artisans in Egypt: goldsmiths, jewelers, sculptors, carpenters, and weavers who worked exclusively for the crown. The objects they produced were of a quality that has never been equaled. Food storage was extensive. Underground magazines filled with sealed jars of grain, oil, wine, and dried meat could supply the palace for months. Egypt's fertile fields and trade networks meant the pharaoh's table never went empty, even in times of drought. Security was constant. The palace guards, elite soldiers armed with spears, shields, and short swords, patrolled day and night. Foreign mercenaries, particularly Nubian and Libyan soldiers, were often employed as personal bodyguards because they had no domestic political loyalties. Mid-morning, the pharaoh entered his throne room to conduct the business of empire. This was governance at its most theatrical. Every petitioner, every official, every diplomat who entered that room faced one overwhelming question: what does the god-king want? The pharaoh did not govern alone. A vast bureaucracy supported him, headed by the vizier, the most powerful official in Egypt after the pharaoh himself. The vizier managed the courts, tax collection, grain distribution, and public works on a daily basis. But major decisions belonged to the pharaoh alone. War and peace, the Nile flood tax rates, temple construction projects, appointments of high priests, diplomatic marriages. These were not delegated. They were made in the throne room, with the full weight of divine authority behind them. Petitioners could approach the throne only with elaborate protocol. They removed their sandals at the palace entrance. They bowed continuously as they approached. Direct eye contact was forbidden. To speak to the pharaoh was to speak to a god, and one did not speak to gods casually. The pharaoh's word was law in the most literal sense. He could speak, and a man's fate was decided instantly. execution, exile, promotion, freedom for a slave, these were delivered without appeal. The court scribes recorded every decision in real time. Tribute arrived at the palace from across Egypt's vast territory and beyond. Gold from Nubia, the richest gold mines in the ancient world. Cedar logs from Lebanon, the finest building timber. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the precious blue stone prized above almost all others. Diplomats from foreign powers brought gifts and letters. In 1000 BC, Egypt was in contact with kingdoms in Canaan, Phoenicia, Libya, Kush, and beyond. The pharaoh's correspondence, found in the Amarna letters, reveals a sophisticated world of international diplomacy. The army reported to the pharaoh. Egypt's military in this period was professional and formidable. Infantry, chariotry, archers, and a naval force for the Nile and the Mediterranean. The pharaoh was technically the supreme commander. Some pharaohs led armies personally. High priests also reported to the pharaoh, because temples were economic as well as religious institutions. In 1000 BC, the priests of Amun at Karnak had become so powerful that in some periods they effectively co-ruled Egypt with the pharaoh, a tension that shaped the entire era. The conflict between pharaoh and priesthood is one of the great dramas of this period. By 1000 BC, the high priest of Amun at Thebes effectively controlled Upper Egypt, while the pharaoh at Tanis controlled Lower Egypt. The divine ruler's power was real, but not unlimited. When a pharaoh spoke in the throne room, he used a specially modulated voice, measured, deep, rhythmic, trained from childhood to carry authority. His words were repeated by a herald, so all in the great hall could hear. Everything he said was recorded by scribes and hieroglyphs. The pharaoh rarely made snap decisions on major matters. He consulted his vizier, his top priests, his military commanders. But the consultation was private. In public, decisions appeared swift and absolute, because doubt was not a quality a god was permitted to display. In 1000 BC, Egypt was navigating the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic series of events that had destroyed civilizations across the Mediterranean. Egypt survived, but weakened. The pharaoh's role now included managing a more fragile empire than his predecessors had commanded. By midday, the formal audience would end. The throne room emptied. The pharaoh withdrew to a private reception area, smaller, less formal, where he could meet with his closest advisors without the full weight of ceremony. Here, the human being behind the divinity had room to think. The burden of decision-making was real. We know from surviving letters that some pharaohs complained of exhaustion, described difficult choices, and expressed uncertainty in their private correspondence. Moments where the god-king revealed himself as a very human man carrying an impossible weight. Still, the system worked. Egypt endured for over 3,000 years, longer than any other civilization in human history. The complex ritual, the bureaucracy, the theology, all of it created a stable system that allowed millions of people to live, work, and thrive along the Nile. Power has a cost, and even a god-king paid it. By noon, the pharaoh had already done more political work than most modern leaders do in a week, and the day had only begun. The midday meal was the largest of the day. The pharaoh's kitchen employed hundreds of workers, bakers, brewers, butchers, confectioners, and spice preparers. The quality of royal food was incomprehensible by the standards of ordinary Egyptians. Meat was the centerpiece of the royal table. Beef was the most prestigious protein, particularly the hump of the ox, considered a delicacy. Roasted duck, goose, and pigeon were also common. Fresh fish from the Nile was consumed in large quantities, especially at religious festivals. Egypt's grain surplus supported a remarkable bakery tradition. Royal bakers produced over 30 different varieties of bread, some flavored with honey, carob, or dates, some shaped into the forms of animals or sacred objects for religious meals. Wine was a royal luxury. Egypt produced wine in the Nile Delta and also imported amphorae from the Levant and Greece. Hieroglyphic labels on jars recorded the vintage year, the vineyard, and the taste, the world's oldest wine reviews written in a dead language. Fruits covered the royal table: pomegranates, figs, dates, grapes, melons, and the rare imported apple. Honey was the primary sweetener, used in both food and medicine. Egyptians kept honeybees in cylindrical clay hives, and the royal apiaries produced enormous quantities. Herbs and spices elevated every dish: cumin, coriander, fenugreek, dill, and garlic. Egyptian cuisine was complex and flavorful, a fact confirmed by analysis of residues found in royal tomb offerings that were meant to feed the pharaoh in the afterlife. During major feast days, celebrating military victories, coronations, or religious festivals, the pharaoh hosted banquets that lasted for days. Hundreds of guests, hundreds of dishes, music, dance, and the obligation of royal generosity to send portions of the feast out to the temples and the poor. Music was everywhere. The pharaoh's court included professional musicians, players of harps, lutes, oboes, lyres, sistrums, sacred rattles, and clappers. The music was considered an offering to the gods as much as a pleasure for the ears. Dancers performed at the royal court in styles ranging from religious to celebratory. Acrobatic female dancers performed at feasts. Specialized ritual dancers performed at temple ceremonies. Dance in ancient Egypt was not entertainment alone. It was a divine act. Storytellers and poets performed works of literature at the royal court. Egypt had a rich tradition of written narrative, love poetry, wisdom texts, adventure stories like the tale of Psusennes I. The pharaoh was expected to be a patron of literature as well as religion and war. The royal hunting park provided both recreation and a symbolic demonstration of power. The pharaoh who could hunt, who could face a charging bull or a wild lion and emerge victorious, embodied the ancient equation between physical courage and divine authority. Chariot rides were a favorite royal pastime and a military necessity. The pharaoh trained as a charioteer from childhood. Chariots in 1000 BC were masterpieces of woodworking, light, fast, and capable of covering enormous distances. The royal chariot was gilded and painted. Board games were played in the royal court. Senet, the oldest board game in the world, was a royal favorite. More than entertainment, Senet had religious meaning. It was a game that symbolized the journey of the soul through the afterlife, played against the invisible presence of fate. Swimming in the Nile or palace pools was a regular activity for the royal family. Egyptian art frequently depicts royal children learning to swim, and texts describe the pharaoh as a powerful swimmer, another symbol of mastery over the Nile and, by extension, all of Egypt. Wrestling and archery were also practiced in the palace courtyard. The pharaoh was expected to maintain physical fitness for both military and theological reasons. A weak or sickly body was incompatible with the image of the god-king. Official records sometimes exaggerated royal athletic feats. As the afternoon sun peaked and the heat became oppressive, the pharaoh withdrew to the cool inner chambers for rest. Even the sleeping schedule of the pharaoh was organized around religion, the midday rest mirroring the sun's pause at its zenith before beginning the descent. The most important duty in the pharaoh's day was not governing, it was religion. Every pharaoh was simultaneously the high priest of every temple in Egypt, the only person theoretically authorized to communicate directly with the gods. In practice, he delegated most priestly functions to the professional priesthood. But for the most sacred rituals, particularly those in the great temples of Amun, Ra, Ta, and Osiris, the pharaoh was required to participate, or a surrogate acting in his name would perform the rite. The great temple at Karnak, dedicated to Amun, was the largest religious complex ever built. Its construction began around 2000 BC and continued for 1500 years. By 1000 BC, it was an almost incomprehensible labyrinth of pylons, hypostyle halls, obelisks, and sacred lakes. A typical temple visit for the pharaoh began with a procession. Priests with shaved heads and white linen robes led the way, burning incense in golden braziers. The smoke rose toward the sky, a visible offering, a ladder of fragrance connecting earth and heaven. Inside the temple, the pharaoh entered progressively more sacred zones. The outer court was accessible to ordinary Egyptians on festival days. The hypostyle hall, forest of painted columns, was for priests only, and the innermost sanctuary for the pharaoh alone, or his priestly representative. In the sanctuary stood the cult statue of the god, a figure of gold or gilded wood, enclosed in a sealed naos, shrine. Each morning, the shrine was ceremonially opened. The god awakened, bathed, anointed, dressed in fresh linen, offered food, and put to sleep again at night. The pharaoh, or the high priest acting in his name, performed this daily ritual. The god must be fed. The god must be cared for. This was not symbolic. Egyptians literally believed that a divine spirit inhabited the statue and required the same daily maintenance a living king would need. Offerings were immense in scale. Each major temple received daily deliveries of bread, beer, beef, fowl, wine, linen, and incense paid from the royal treasury. After the ritual offering, food was redistributed to the priests and workers who maintained the temple, a form of ancient welfare state. Temple walls recorded the pharaoh's deeds in stone, battle victories, offerings made to the gods, diplomatic achievements, religious festivals. These inscriptions were not merely historical records, they were magical acts. What was written in stone was made permanent, eternal, real. In 1000 BC, the temples were also enormous economic engines. Temple estates owned vast tracts of farmland, herds of cattle, vineyards, fishing rights, and mining concessions. The wealth flowing through Karnak alone rivaled the pharaoh's own treasury, which explains the priest's political power. The festival of Opet, one of the greatest religious celebrations of the Egyptian year, required the pharaoh's presence. During this month-long festival, the statue of Amun was carried in a gilded bark from Karnak to the Luxor temple and back. Thousands of people lined the route. During the festival of Opet, something remarkable happened. The pharaoh entered the inner sanctuary alone and emerged, according to theology, renewed and recharged with divine power. Whatever passed between the pharaoh and the god in that private moment, no scribe recorded it. Oracle rituals also involved the pharaoh. Priests carrying the god's bark would seem to move, one direction for yes, one for no, answering questions on legal disputes, succession crises, or military decisions. The pharaoh had to appear to accept the god's verdict, even when it conflicted with his own preference. The construction of new temples was one of the most important acts a pharaoh could perform, both spiritually and politically. Building a temple employed thousands of workers, demonstrated divine favor, secured the priesthood's loyalty, and created an eternal monument to the ruler's piety. In 1000 BC, new temple construction continued despite Egypt's relative political fragmentation. Pharaohs of the 21st and 22nd dynasties added to existing complexes and built new sanctuaries, proving that even in a period of reduced power, the religious function of kingship remained non-negotiable. As evening approached and the temple fires were lit, the pharaoh's priestly duties were complete for the day. He had offered to the gods. He had maintained Ma'at. He had done the spiritual work that kept Egypt's universe from unraveling. Now came the evening and the burdens of eternity. For the temple was never merely a place of worship. It was the interface between the human world and the divine world. And the pharaoh was the one person who stood, every day, with one foot in each. The pharaoh's body was a political asset as much as a personal one. Any sign of physical weakness, illness, injury, advancing age, was carefully managed and often concealed. A sick god-king was a theological impossibility and a political disaster. Egyptian medicine in 1000 BC was sophisticated and documented. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts ever found, lists hundreds of treatments for everything from headaches to crocodile bites. Royal physicians were among the most highly educated people in Egypt. The royal physician had a complex job. He treated real medical conditions, dental problems. Egyptian grain contained stone fragments from grinding that wore down teeth terribly, eye infections, digestive issues, and the parasites that infested even the finest Nile water. Dental health was a genuine problem for pharaohs despite their privilege. Archaeological examination of royal mummies has revealed severe tooth decay, abscesses, and bone loss from dental infections. More than one pharaoh may have died from complications related to infected teeth. Royal physicians blended real medicine with magic, because the two were inseparable in Egyptian thought. A treatment for fever included both willow bark, which contains a precursor to aspirin and genuinely works, and an accompanying spell addressed to the deity of illness. The royal apothecary was stocked with hundreds of remedies: honey, which has genuine antimicrobial properties; castor oil, a real laxative; natron, used to treat infections; myrrh, genuine antiseptic, alongside frankincense, cedar oil, and dozens of plant compounds. Mummies of Egyptian royals reveal a life of surprising physical hardship behind the luxury. Ramesses II, who reigned just before this period, had severe arthritis, hardened arteries, and dental disease. Even god-kings could not escape the frailties of human biology. Mental health was addressed through religious means. If the pharaoh suffered from what we might call anxiety or depression, and the evidence suggests some did, priests prescribed rituals, prayers, and specific recitations designed to restore emotional balance and drive out malevolent spirits. Sleep was sacred. The pharaoh's dreams were considered divine communication, messages from the gods that required interpretation. A class of specialist priests called seers of the gods analyzed royal dreams and advised on their meaning. Some major military and political decisions were influenced by dream interpretation. Aging was managed with remarkable grace in the Egyptian worldview. Senior pharaohs were depicted in official art as eternally young and physically perfect. But in reality, court records and mummies reveal men dealing with obesity, joint pain, and the accumulated damage of a physically demanding ceremonial life. Death was not feared in the Egyptian worldview, at least not officially. It was a transition. The pharaoh who had lived righteously would be judged favorably by Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths. His heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If lighter than the feather, paradise. If heavier, oblivion. But the preparations for death began the moment the pharaoh ascended the throne. His tomb was commissioned immediately. His mortuary temple was planned. His funerary priests were appointed. The entire elaborate machinery of Egyptian afterlife preparation was set in motion, and it never stopped until he died. No element of a pharaoh's life was more carefully planned than his death. The royal tomb was not a grave. It was a vehicle, a permanent spiritual machine designed to launch the pharaoh's soul into eternity and maintain him there forever. By 1000 BC, the era of the Great Pyramids was 1,000 years in the past. Pharaohs of this period were buried in the Valley of the Kings, a remote desert valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the cliffs naturally formed a shape resembling a pyramid. The Valley of the Kings contained dozens of royal tombs cut deep into the limestone, some descending over 100 meters into the rock through corridors, chambers, and passages richly decorated with religious texts and images designed to guide the soul through the afterlife. The most famous text was the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the underworld. Each pharaoh's version was personalized, inscribed on papyrus or carved into the tomb walls, intended to be recited by the soul as it journeyed through each gate of the afterlife. Tomb robbing was an ancient problem. Even in 1000 BC, centuries after the greatest pharaohs, thieves had penetrated most of the older tombs, stripping them of their treasures. The priesthood undertook a massive royal cache operation, moving mummies to secret locations to protect them. One of the most remarkable historical events of this period was the reburial of royal mummies. Priests discovered that tomb after tomb had been robbed. In response, they gathered the mummies of the greatest pharaohs, including Ramesses II and Seti III, and hid them in a single concealed cache. This cache, discovered in 1881 at Deir el-Bahri, contained over 40 royal mummies spanning centuries of Egyptian history. It was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. Those mummies rest today in the Cairo Museum, 3,000-year-old faces that you can still look at. The mummification process for a royal body was extraordinary. The brain was removed through the nostrils with a hook. The organs were extracted through a cut in the side and placed in 4 canopic jars, each protected by a different deity's spirit. The body was packed in natron for 70 days. The dried body was then wrapped in hundreds of meters of fine linen bandages with amulets, protective talismans, placed at specific points on the body as it was wrapped. Sacred texts were inscribed on the wrappings themselves. The entire process took 70 days from death to final sealing. The royal burial goods were staggering in their richness. Tutankhamun's tomb, a relatively minor king, contained over 5,000 objects. A major king's burial would have contained far more: furniture of gold and ebony, chariots, weapons, clothing, jewelry, food, wine, and models of servants. Shabtis, small figurines designed to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife, one for every day of the year, were essential burial equipment. If commanded to work in the fields of the afterlife, the Shabti would answer, "Here I am," and do the labor in the pharaoh's place. Even in paradise, divine status had privileges. The mortuary temple, built on the Nile's west bank facing the tomb, was where offerings were made to the dead king for eternity. Priests dedicated to the pharaoh's cult would continue these offerings for generations, sometimes for centuries after his death. Some mortuary cults lasted for over 1,000 years. The cult of Thutmose III, for example, received offerings well into the later periods of Egyptian history. The pharaoh was not simply buried, he was maintained, fed, and worshipped as a divine ancestor whose power continued to benefit Egypt. The Book of the Amduat, what is in the underworld, described the pharaoh's nightly journey through the 12 hours of darkness. Ra's solar bark traveled through the underworld, encountering monsters and dead souls, before emerging reborn at dawn. The pharaoh was believed to join this journey every night. War was inseparable from Egyptian kingship. The image of the pharaoh smiting his enemies, one hand gripping the hair of a kneeling captive, the other raised with a weapon, was the single most repeated image in all of Egyptian art. It was not just a symbol, it was a theological statement. By 1000 BC, Egypt's military power had diminished from the empire-building heights of Ramesses II. But the professional army remained a formidable force. The pharaoh was its supreme commander. Whether or not he personally rode to battle, his divine blessing was considered essential for victory. Egyptian soldiers in this period were well equipped. Infantry carried bronze or iron-tipped spears, shields of cowhide stretched over wooden frames, and short swords or kepesh, sickle-shaped blades that could hook around an enemy's shield. Archers carried composite bows of remarkable range and accuracy. The chariot corps was the elite unit of the Egyptian army, the ancient world's equivalent of armored cavalry. Chariots carried a driver and a warrior archer, striking enemy lines at high speed before wheeling away. The pharaoh's own chariot was identifiable by its gold fittings and was a primary target for enemy generals. Nubian mercenaries, called medjay, served as elite infantry and police. Their skill with the bow was legendary. Libyan warriors also served in large numbers in this period, and by 945 BC, a Libyan military dynasty, the 22nd dynasty, would take the throne. Further evidence of how permeable the boundaries of Egypt had become. Intelligence was a sophisticated military tool. Egyptian scouts and spies operated in enemy territory, and diplomatic channels provided advance warning of hostile movements. The letter archives that have survived reveal a pharaoh constantly receiving reports from agents across the ancient Near East. Military campaigns were announced with religious ceremony. Before any army marched, the pharaoh consulted oracles, made offerings at the relevant war deity's temple, usually Montu, the hawk-headed god of war, and received a divine endorsement. An oracle that opposed a campaign could delay or cancel military plans. The logistics of an Egyptian army on campaign were staggering. Thousands of soldiers required food, water, weapons, and medical care across desert and foreign terrain. The army traveled with a supply train of donkeys, oxen, and later camels, supported by river transport on the Nile where possible. Victory was celebrated with elaborate public ceremonies. Captive enemies were paraded through the capital in chains. Tribute, gold, cattle, exotic animals, raw materials, was publicly counted and deposited in the royal treasury. The pharaoh appeared on his balcony to receive the adulation of the crowd. Defeated enemies were treated according to their status and the strategic situation. Foreign kings might be executed as an example, or kept as honored hostages. Common soldiers might be enslaved, resettled as farmers, or incorporated into the Egyptian army as foreign auxiliaries. Diplomacy was often preferred to war. The marriage alliance system, where the pharaoh received daughters of foreign kings as wives, was a cornerstone of Egyptian foreign policy. These women brought their own retinues, their own customs, and in some cases, their own gods into the royal court. The borders of Egypt in 1000 BC were defended by a series of frontier forts, particularly in the Sinai and in Nubia. These were permanent garrison towns, staffed by professional soldiers, equipped with granaries and water wells, and connected by messenger relay systems to the capital. The pharaoh's military reputation was managed carefully. Even when Egypt's armies were defeated, and they were sometimes, official records depicted victory. Battle reliefs on temple walls showed the pharaoh heroically smiting enemies. Propaganda was not invented by modern governments. War victories were immortalized in the great temple inscriptions that still survive today. The Battle of Kadesh, fought by Ramesses II a few generations before 1000 BC, is documented in the world's oldest known peace treaty, and the victory, it was actually a draw, is described in poetry, prose, and stone reliefs that cover entire temple walls. By 1000 BC, Egypt's military focus had turned inward as much as outward. Internal power struggles between priestly factions and royal dynasties sometimes erupted into conflict. The pharaoh had to manage military loyalty as carefully as he managed divine theology. Even in war, the pharaoh was surrounded by ceremony. Before a major battle, he performed a dawn ritual to Amun, seeking divine protection. After victory, he performed thanksgiving offerings. The battlefield itself was a temple of sorts, a place where divine will was made manifest through arms. But the greatest battle every pharaoh faced was not against foreign enemies. It was against time, against the fragility of the body, against the decay that waited for everything, including god-kings, in the long silence of the desert. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, the direction of the dead, the palace shifted from the busy hum of governance to the quieter rhythms of evening. This transition, too, was religious. The sunset was Ra's death, and the pharaoh's prayers would help him be reborn at dawn. The evening meal was lighter than the midday feast, more intimate. The pharaoh might dine with his great royal wife, his children, his closest advisors. In these private moments, the theatrical distance of the throne room dissolved, and a real human conversation could occur. Music and poetry filled the evening court. Love songs, among the most beautiful literature to survive from the ancient world, were performed in the royal halls. Egyptian love poetry is astonishingly modern in its tenderness, its longing, its imagery of the beloved as a garden and the lover as a bird. Children ran through the royal gardens. Even god-kings were fathers, and some inscriptions suggest they were fond ones. Royal children were educated in multiple languages: mathematics, astronomy, theology, military tactics, and literature. An Egyptian prince was expected to be the most educated person in the country. The evening ritual in the temple, closing the shrine, putting the god to sleep, mirrored the morning ritual in reverse. Every action of the day formed a circle: waking and sleeping, opening and closing, sunrise and sunset. Egyptian time was cyclical, not linear. The past was not behind you. It was the foundation beneath you. Private prayer was part of the evening. Individual Egyptians at all levels of society maintained personal piety, small household shrines to favorite deities, personal amulets, private prayers offered without priestly intermediary. The pharaoh, despite his official divine status, also had personal gods he prayed to in private. Some pharaohs wrote poetry. Some were depicted playing musical instruments. At least one, Akhenaten, a few generations before 1000 BC, was a revolutionary religious thinker who wrote theology that influenced later monotheistic traditions. The pharaoh was not just a king or a soldier, he was sometimes an artist and a philosopher. The palace at night was a different place from the palace at day. Fewer people. Dimmer light, oil lamps and fires casting warm amber shadows on painted walls, the sound of water in the garden pool, the distant chanting of night shift priests keeping the eternal vigil in the temple. The pharaoh's night was guarded more carefully than any other time. Ancient Egypt believed that the night, like the underworld, was full of dangers for the soul. Protective spells were spoken over the sleeping king. Amulets were placed at the four corners of his bed. Guards stood at every door. Dreams, as we have seen, were divine communications. But nightmares were visitations of malevolent forces. A pharaoh who woke from a bad dream would immediately consult a priest interpreter and perform a protective ritual, smearing specific substances on his hands or reciting counterspells before returning to sleep. Succession planning was a constant low-level anxiety for any pharaoh. Which son would inherit? If the great royal wife had no sons, could a son of a secondary wife ascend? The succession was declared publicly. The crown prince was designated early and trained alongside his father, but rival princes were always a potential threat. The murders, plots, and palace intrigues of the Egyptian royal court rival anything from later European history. The Turin Papyrus describes a conspiracy against Ramesses III, in which members of his own harem plotted his assassination. A case tried in ancient court records that survive to this day. By 1000 BC, Egypt had entered a long twilight. Not the end. The civilization had 5 more centuries of meaningful power and would survive under foreign rulers for another millennium after that. But the days of empire were past. The new pharaohs were stewards of a legacy, not builders of a new one. The 21st dynasty rulers at Tanis, the pharaohs of 1000 BC, were genuinely pious men who maintained the traditions with care. Their tombs were modest by earlier standards, but exquisitely crafted. Their gold masks and jewelry, found intact in the 1940s, are among the most beautiful objects ever made. Psusennes I, one of the most important pharaohs of this exact period, had an intact burial discovered in 1940 with a solid silver coffin inside a solid gold one. His burial rivaled Tutankhamun's in richness, yet almost no one knows his name. History, like the desert, buries things unevenly. Egypt in 1000 BC was not in decline. It was adapting. The great bureaucratic machine that had taken 3,000 years to build continued to function. Hieroglyphs were still carved. Offerings were still made. The Nile still flooded. The gods were still appeased. The system worked. What makes Egypt remarkable, what makes the pharaoh remarkable, is the sheer persistence of the civilization. 3,000 years of continuous culture, the same religious system, the same artistic conventions, the same language, evolving but recognizable. No civilization in human history has matched this endurance. When we look at the pharaoh of 1000 BC, we see not just one man, but the weight of 2,000 years of tradition pressing down on him. He did not invent the ceremonies he performed. He inherited them, performed them faithfully, and passed them on. He was a link in the longest chain in human history, and yet he was also a person. He had headaches. He had favorites among his children. He worried about the harvest. He appreciated a good poem. He felt the sun on his face in the morning when he stepped into the garden, and for a moment he was not a god but a man, blinking in the warm Egyptian light. The pharaoh of 1000 BC is 3,000 years away from us, and yet the things that mattered to him, love, power, fear, legacy, the question of what happens after we die, are the same things that keep you awake tonight. The treasures he was buried with, the gold masks, the amulets, the inscribed spells, were his attempt to answer the unanswerable question, to defeat time, to make something permanent in a world where everything turns to sand. He failed, as all of us will. The tombs were robbed, the palaces crumbled, the priests who chanted for him fell silent. Even the Nile has shifted its course, but the story survived. It survived in stone. It survived in papyrus. It survived in the extraordinary human need to be remembered. And now you know it. You know how the pharaoh woke, what he ate, what he feared, how he ruled, how he prayed, and what he hoped for in the darkness beyond death. The information that was carved in stone for eternity has reached you, across 3,000 years in 10 minutes. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak someone's name was to give them life again. So say it. Psusennes I, Amun, Osorkon, the pharaohs of 1000 BC, half forgotten by history, rulers of the greatest civilization that ever was. They built their lives to last forever, and in a way, through the papyrus, through the stone, through the art that has survived every war and every desert wind, they did. The question the ancient Egyptians would ask you across 3,000 years of silence is this: what are you building that will outlast you? What have you done today that the desert winds cannot erase? The pharaoh of 1000 BC spent his entire life trying to answer that question. What is your answer? Tell us in the comments below.